Mr. Gefen, I wonder what you make of the Russian Defense Ministry making the announcement, virtually outing Israel as being behind that strike. Why?
Well, this last week event was an exchange of messages actually between the various players, and we have here at least 4 or 5 players. We didn't hear the US, yes, but America is a player as well. It started with Israel sending a message on Sunday midday that probably related to Iranian cargo aircraft or cargo that approaching Damascus area, and then this missile that was mentioned. And then Israel retaliated because Israel is saying we will not accept another front here similar to the Hezbollah. The Iranians responded with the message of their Air Force commander. So there was an escalation. Prime Minister responded. The Russians still keep relatively a quiet posture. They are, if you recall what happened 2 months ago. So they are in between. They understand Israel need. They understand that the Iranians cannot be thrown out, so they try to keep it in between. And the interesting thing is the Syrians, because the Syrians actually are positive on all the fronts, and probably they made a mistake at trying to intercept the aircraft, the local maybe or not. So if you look at this event, it's in a whole, it's a very interesting event. And it's still evolving exchange of messages. So we have to keep, everybody has clear statements to make Israel, the Iranians, the Syrian did not make so. And the Russian is a very big kind of ambiguity. We have to listen what the American will say, because Pompeo, as you recall, mentioned that Israel has all the right to fight Iranian and throw them out of Syria.
Emily, this is of course not the first time Israel has admitted to striking in Syria. They didn't admit this time around, but in the past they have. And these 2 locations that were struck, the airport and Al-Kiswe, were exact locations that we've seen before involved in strikes like this.
Yes, Ayman. Some strong messages here, particularly with the admittance, and there are a few target audiences, I believe, to this admittance. Firstly, I would speak about the United States. We know that this comes in the wake of the Trump administration's decision to withdraw troops from Syria. And this could be a message to the United States and Syria and Russia that with that withdrawal comes Israel stepping up to the responsibility, saying that it won't allow Iran to encroach upon its border, and taking that responsibility into its hands, striking targets that it believes are dangerous to Israel. I would also say this sends a message to Russia. We've seen Russia in the past put forward a plan or a suggestion, even saying that it might curtail Iranian influence in Syria. Well, this could be a message to the Kremlin saying, if you're trying to do that, if you're really trying to do it, you mentioned Kiswe, that's just about 45 kilometers from the Israeli border. You're not being successful at it, and we need to take action and try to curtail that influence ourselves. And then if we look at the message it sends to Syria and also potentially Iran, it's again that policy of no tolerance, that Israel is prepared. And I attended a security briefing this morning with a national security advisor who said this really sends a strong message from the Israeli military that Israel's prepared to take military action in this case against the Iranian encroachment.
Mr. Gefen, we began discussing the issue of the Iranian interest before the break, and I want to delve deeper into this now. What are they doing? It seems like it doesn't make any sense, at least not to Israeli eyes.
Yeah, if you look the last 2 years, you see the following pattern. They are sending equipment, continuing sending equipment with hundreds of millions of dollars, destroyed at the airport or the warehouses in Homs, Hamat, wherever they can be found. They know that they are visible. The Iranians understand they are visible to the Israeli intelligence. They are the Israeli Air Force or can destruct at any point, at any time in Syria. But they keep going on sending the equipment. Damascus airport looked like probably the moon with the craters. So the question is, what leads them? I guess the Israelis, when Israeli analysts watching now and trying to understand the Iranians, it probably has to do with something back in internal rifts within the Iranian regime. On one side is Qasem Soleimani, who represent the pure ideology of expansion of the revolution spirit and so on, and the others that are asking, look inside Iran, we are in troubles, we have to look after our people. So far, he's had Qasem Soleimani has had the upper hand. Mm-hmm. And the question is, now I guess everybody will asking, how long will it go on with these few, fruitless efforts, as long as we can judge it.
And Emily, we know, of course, the calls always coming from Iran for the destruction of Israel. This has become the general soundbite that keeps recurring. But is it deeper than that? And as Mr. Gefen tells us, maybe this is an expansionist ambition on Tehran's part?
Well, certainly Iran seeks to create what is now referred to as a Shiite crescent, and that is a landmass. And actually, if we go back to what we were discussing with the Iran-Iraq border, that's just where U.S. troops withdrew from. We even just looked 4 days ago, there was a report circulating that Pompeo actually told the Iraqi prime minister that if Israel wishes to strike, the U.S. won't stand in its way. So we're seeing interesting developments in the sense that there are Iranian-backed militias, even in that volatile Iran-Iraq border. We know that Iran seeks to expand in those areas as well as all the way through Syria, connecting its landmass. And Israel now proving today with these strikes that it's not willing to back down. But on the other hand, as we mentioned, the attacks, the targets that we've seen Israel target over and over again around Damascus, those are very similar targets. So there's a strong message here from Iran that no matter how many times Israel strikes, it's willing to rebuild, it's willing to reassert itself in that area, and it's willing to continue its expansion in that area and its military development.
Well, I want to bring in another player who might want to comment on this, and that's, of course, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Reports on Al-Mayadeen saying he might give a speech later on this week and likely to address the situation in Syria. And as you know, the Hezbollah leader hasn't been seen for quite some time. There were reports of his failing health and a long absence from the public eye. And Mr. Gefen, we can expect Nasrallah to say pretty much what he's always said over recent years?
That might be. We all are very curious to see what happened here, because it's so untypical for Nasrallah to be quiet on the event of the Northern Shield. So we are a lot of speculations. Some of them are related to internal Lebanese problem. There is no government. There's a huge deficit. They need a very urgent economical aid and imminent, and this is one problem, probably effective. But the other one relates to the Iranians we've mentioned, because actually Nasrallah is controlled totally by the Iranians. He's financed by them. He's trained by them. His targets are determined by the Iranians. For instance, he sent troops to Syria, even in times where he was reluctant to do so. He sent troops that were killed there, and he has to answer his people. But he's totally controlled. So whatever he says, he will say. Probably it was filtered and screened by the Iranians, so we have to see. He's an asset to the Iranian, because he created an image to the Israeli public of somebody who is threatening, and the Iranian understand it. It might be a placate. He might be reiterating phrases that he was told to reiterate by the Iranians. So I guess we all very anxious to see to hear. By the way, if he will not speak, it might be also that he will because if you recall, the day Northern Shield started, it was in the noontime. At 7 o'clock, he was supposed to speak, and it was just disappeared. This time slot was null.
But in light of that, and Emily, I want to bring you in on this as well. As Mr. Gefen tells us, Hezbollah, or the Hezbollah leader, is completely in the hands of the Iranians. Israel recently destroyed Hezbollah tunnels on the border. Reports of his failing health, and he's not seen. Is Hezbollah in any position to be a threat to Israel right now?
Well, we have to remember that his predecessor was assassinated by Israelis in 1992. So one of the reasons for his disappearance could be that he is afraid for his own well-being, and that could explain why he sort of disappeared from the public eye. And we also have to remember that he does typically give an address at this time of year, so this might not be atypical. If we're looking back at what Hezbollah's position is, we know that it's considered to be a stronger military force in Lebanon than, for instance, the Lebanese army, and it has been able to really bolster its military capacity in Lebanon. It does pose a threat, but likely, or it does pose some certain element of a threat, that's for sure. Likely what we're going to see, though, I believe in this address, is very much of the same rhetoric that we have seen throughout Nasrallah's addresses in the past. That is speech against Israel, speaking about Israeli, in quotations, aggression against, perhaps even against the Lebanese people or other forces, and of course threats to take action and retaliate for Northern Shield.